Hello and welcome to the Little Knowledge podcast. And with me, Paul Busby, and as ever with Goff Morgan. Hi, Goff.
Hello, everybody. Greetings to you. Very
How
nice
are
to be
you?
back. I'm fine and dandy, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, no, well, we're working bunnies now. We've got jobs and things and livelihoods and stuff. It is. Yeah. I almost miss the days of being continually confined to the house.
Yeah, because your social life is so different now, Goff. No, I know exactly what you mean. But we're actually talking today about a place that's really quite close. This feels like home turf to me. I don't know about you, Goff.
Yes, yeah. It's something that we've been to it and we know of it, and it's a cozy jumper of a story for us today.
Yeah, I think so. It's Ruperra Castle, as you'll know after clicking on the video entitled Ruperra Castle.
Forgive me.
But that name first appears in the 1550s, and it means hill or slope of pear trees.
So,
I think it is Ruperra. Yeah. And the trust that own the Coed Craig Ruperra, the wood there, have been planting pear trees, wild pear trees, to sort of bring it back.
Oh, really nice.
Which is very good. But for those that don't know where Ruperra is, let's get a little map up here. Now, what you can see is the castle. And for those of you who have seen our videos before, we go to the south here, you should see another familiar place, Kevin Mabley. So we did Kevin Mabley, which seemed months ago. And you just go a little bit north. Its next door neighbor is Ruperra Castle, which you can see here.
Yeah.
Now, again, as always, this is at the very start of the 20th century, late 19th century. A lot of the videos we've done, as soon as we've superimposed a modern photograph, it's looked completely different, hasn't it?
Yes.
Modern cities have been right up to the doorstep. In many cases, they have obliterated the property that we're talking about. Not so much this case, but also there are some very interesting bits. Can you see here, Goff, where it says chapel and graveyard?
Oh, yes, I noticed that as we were going around, yeah.
If we just superimpose, you will see disappears completely.
Oh, yes, look at that. Oh, interesting.
Now, they did do a geophys, I think it was 2004, maybe, of this area to see if they could find any evidence of this so-called chapel. And they did. They found evidence of the chapel. They found evidence of other buildings grouped around it, which suggests there was agricultural activity, quite thriving agricultural activity here in Norman times.
Oh, how interesting.
So it'd be interesting to find one day a bit more about that chapel. You also notice that nothing else really changed an awful lot.
No.
The castle,
no,
it's still
pretty much
in beautiful countryside.
Yeah.
Now, the other important thing to spot here in the Craig Ruperra is this mound.
Yes.
Now, the mound here became a summer house in later years, but that's really where our story begins, because Ruperra is at the foot pretty much of an Iron Age hill fort. So you've got the Iron Age.
Very suggestive, that, isn't it? Because if you look at Tredegar House, which is obviously the companion property to this, it is also at the foot of an Iron Age hill fort. So it is very peculiar, and they're both positioned within those areas. And it makes you wonder whether, the family's connection with the territories go back into a very long way.
Well, it's certainly possible. If we have a little look at the top of this Iron Age hill fort, the motte, actually, because in Norman times, a motte was added to it. So there would have been a wooden castle up here in 1100.
Yeah.
As the Normans, it's that Robert Fitzhamon again, has sort of taken over the area, and they've got a small Norman motte here to maintain order. And that probably was used until 1274, when Caerphilly Castle was built and rendered this obsolete and redundant, really.
Oh, gosh.
But if you climb up through the beautiful countryside to the very top, and it's 591 feet above sea level here, so it gave them a good view. You can see the view all around here. Here's a little dog.
Oh yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. Got a really command of the landscape there, even if you're on top of that place.
Now, in later years,
what's that peculiar black blob in the middle of the picture?
Black blob?
Yeah, in the middle of the picture, there was a sort of shadowy sort of thing.
Oh, that's the dog.
About the other way.
The dog.
Oh, it's a dog, is it?
Yeah, it's a dog. The person who took the photograph, a dog has got in the way.
Oh, yeah, I see. Yeah. I wonder what it was. You know, like some sort of slightly blurred badger.
The blurred badger of Ruperra. On certain nights.
Certain nights, this slightly smeared badger goes past you. Yeah.
Now, in later years, is it interesting how families use these historic features in the landscape? You mentioned Tredegar House, how their Iron Age hill fort became part of the garden landscape and part of the deer park. And in much later years, part of a golf course as well.
Yes, good.
But here what they did was they created a summer house, possibly several summer houses. The 17th century summer house, or 18th, probably 17th century, is from this wall, which has been rebuilt in places.
Yeah.
It was a very large stone 2-story summer house. Must have been quite impressive.
Yeah. And
then in later years, they put a much smaller summer house with a thatched roof in the footprint of the summer house. So what I mean by that is, we have a little look at some pictures. There we are. If you're climbing up, this is what you see.
Oh, yes.
We've reached here. There we are. Climb up another little bit. And there's the view again.
Yeah.
But this picture is interesting because it shows, can you see that?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, you can see workers at Ruperra with the thatched, they're up on top of the motte with the thatched summer house.
Yeah, gosh.
The later one.
Yeah. It's not as impressive as the 2-story one, really, is it? It's almost very domestic, a little thing you'd see in a sort of largish garden now. Yeah.
No, you're right. It's not quite as spectacular, is it? But there we go. But there it is. Just stop the share a minute and come back. So that's the oldest bit, as you could say, is the motte. So if you think you've got a Norman activity at the bottom down there, you've got a Norman castle overlooking it. I mean, the history on this one really does go back a long, long way, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. And you end up, again, by positioning your properties by it, you're actually giving yourself an association with the longevity of that landscape feature as well. So you're not saying, we know we've been around forever and we're going to go on forever. It's one of those statements of permanence, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But as far as the earlier people to own it weren't Morgans at all. They were the Lewis family. So the Lewis family of Ruperra owned it first, and they carried on right up until really the late 1500s. But talking about that mound and the things that may or may not have happened there, again, as we go back to the view, they did find something here, didn't they, Goff, when they were building one of these summer houses. And they did find something very interesting in the 18th century.
Oh, yeah, yes. My brain had wandered. Yes, yeah. If you bear with me a moment, I wasn't expecting to get to him quite so soon. Yeah, if we just pop this up, we are referring, of course, to this. Not literally this gentleman, but they found a skeleton. They found a skeleton standing upright when they were building it. It says an article in Country Life, this is in 1986 even, quotes a letter from the Reverend W. Watkins from around the year 1762, in which he records the bizarre discovery of an erect skeleton in a room 2.5 meters square during the digging of the foundations of a summer house at Ruperra. Now, I mean, that is like absolutely bizarre. Why? And it's on top. I mean, realize the positioning of this as well. This figure is in a, obviously at the top of the very top of the mound, standing in a squared off room. I mean, that's obviously underneath the ground as well. So very peculiar. I mean, it says it has been speculated that this could be the skeleton of Kadugan, born around 1430, who was reputed to be an illegitimate son of Gwilym of Ruperra. Little is known of him, apart from a reference by an antiquary called George T. Clarke in an 1886 work on Welsh genealogy. And what he basically says is Kadugan built and died in the tower long called after him at Ruperra. So, I mean, the implication of that is quite nice, because it gives you an idea that the tower, one of the towers at the top of the place, was called Kadugan's Tower. So that's all, yeah, very, very, very intriguing. But that's it. That's as much as we know about this, other than it is an historic fact. It's not a sort of apocryphal tale. It's not, and its location is not within the main house of the castle. So you haven't got the traditional Gothic walled up skeleton in the wall business. But you sort of wonder possibly how far they dug down into this mound and whether they uncovered something that was actually buried in the original mound even, and not being in that time of archaeological discovery to be able to date a skeleton or look at things around it or whatever. So it might have been a pre-existing tomb, but standing up is interesting. Standing burial.
That's rare and upright burial, isn't it? I got, well, the first time I heard this many years ago, I got a little bit excited because all I heard was Kadugan is buried here. And Kadugan was king of Gwent and Morganu. The chance of having it being a king's grave at Ruperra, but as you quite rightly say, there was another chap with the same name who actually lived at the site, which seems much more likely, really, doesn't it? But I do love that. Have you got any theories about that?
No, I really can't puzzle it at all. It seems to be without context almost, doesn't it? As to why it is actually there. Why did they settle on it as it being this son of Gwilym of Ruperra? How did that come about in that article in the 1700s?
What you read was all that there is.
1886.
So we don't know if they read something with Kadugan's name on. It's so frustrating, isn't it? What do they do with him?
Yeah, massive. Well, quite. Yeah, it's all massively frustrating little gobbit of information, isn't it? The whole reasoning behind it is why it's there is murky, and then how they came to this conclusion about who it was is equally murky. So,
well, I don't mind a bit of murk. I quite like the idea. So, anyone out there who has got a theory of why they might bury a skeleton straight up, upright, I'd be interested to know. If it has any precedence in South Wales in particular.
It does suggest a recollection within an area of there being a tower on top of this hill in the 1400s period. Because 1470, when they say that he's supposed to have been buried in the tower he built, died and buried in the tower he built at the top of the hill. So obviously there was something still standing or floating around at the top there at that period in time.
Yeah, well, who knows? It's one of those just sort of tantalizing little mysteries at the moment. Well, probably forever, if we're honest. But the Lewis family failed in the male line. This happens a lot in this story, Goff. The Lewises failed in the male line. And and the last one to live there was Margaret Lewis, who became she had probably about 800 acres, and she was the heiress to Ruperra, whatever Ruperra looked like at that time. It was probably a house on the current footprint of the current Ruperra Castle. But either way, she married this man. Now, he was a seventh son. Turned out all right. He was a grandson of the Morgans of Machen. He was the fourth son of Edmund, or seventh overall son of Edmund Morgan. So again, he has to go out. If you're a seventh son, you have to go out and make your fortune. There are no two ways about it. It's not going to be handed to you. So he did very well to catch Margaret. She was Margaret Lewis. She was quite a catch. And he marries her, and he does extraordinarily well for himself. This is Thomas Morgan. Well, it might be Thomas Morgan. Because it says here, and this is a painting that's at Tredegar House. It came back, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. And it says clearly Thomas Morgan of Machen, and it says aged 52. But as Octavius Morgan, the historian and professional Morgan, you could say, points out, it doesn't fit. No dates fit to a Thomas Morgan of Machen at that age in that period. So he thinks it's been mislabeled. later
Oh,
on. Not
interesting.
unheard of course, not
Yeah,
unheard
right,
of
no.
at all. So he's got two ideas. One, it could be a slightly earlier painting of the old Sir William Morgan of Tredegar House, who lived into his to brush in his 90s.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Maybe. Or it could be Sir Thomas Morgan of Ruperra. So we'll take Sir Thomas Morgan of Ruperra for today's podcast purposes.
Yeah.
Here he is. Because he gets a pretty good gig. He becomes steward to one of the most powerful men in Wales. This is the second Earl of Pembroke. We've got a Herbert thrown into things. They're never far away, are they?
No, right now.
So there he is. There's the second Earl of Pembroke. He becomes steward to him, and it involves all kinds of things. Being in charge of pageants and masks. And then when the third Earl takes over, this dashing character, he plays the same role for him as well.
Oh, right.
But it does Thomas does very well for himself, because at Wilton he gets knighted by King James I in 1623. So he becomes Sir Thomas Morgan of Ruperra. And not just that. Oh, by the way, this one died owing Sir Thomas money. Which was
right.
convenient, because he really needed it at that point in history. But Sir Thomas was also made surveyor of the royal forests below the Trent. And because Wilton is Herbert territory, the Earl of Pembroke put Sir Thomas Morgan forward as MP for Wilton 7 times. And therefore, Sir Thomas Morgan was MP for Wilton 7 times. Because, of course, that's the way it works.
Yeah.
So he became a bigwig, really, Sir Thomas Morgan. He had a very fiery son, Sir Philip Morgan, who murdered a man for jilting his sister.
Oh, blimey.
Don't jilt a Morgan is the message to this tale.
No, yeah, quite, yeah. Was there any comeuppance for that?
No, not really, because as the years went on, Sir Philip Morgan was the man who looked after King Charles I when he turned up at Ruperra Castle during the Civil War. So,
oh, gosh.
They managed to wriggle out of it, probably with Herbert help. If the Earl of Pembroke's on your side, there are ways out of these things, as you could appreciate. But he needed a new house, because this is now an important man, Sir Thomas Morgan of Ruperra, and the old Lewis property wouldn't cut the mustard. So he creates this marvelously romantic pageant-style castle. And as a man who was involved in lots of pageants, and took part in lots of them, it was the ideal chivalric romantic backdrop. But it looked originally a bit different than it does today. This is a fascinating little drawing. 1627, we think Ruperra, his new home, Ruperra Castle, as it was now known, was finished in 1626. So in 1627, we've got this little drawing, and we have dormer windows here, and we've got, which is very much a little bit like the Van Mansion, and it was lime washed like the Van Mansion is, and St. Fagans, for those of you who know St. Fagans, very similar. But we have these castellated towers.
Long towers, yeah. And so that gatehouse at the bottom.
And you've got, well, what this is a porch.
Yeah, but it looked like a gatehouse, isn't it, as well?
Well, we've got a view of, do you remember the Duke of Beaufort's progress, Goff? I think we did it in the Margam episode, where the Duke of Beaufort becomes Lord President of Wales, essentially. And he parades around Wales like a monarch. And he goes to various places, and he has his little artist friend with him called Dinley, or probably Dinley, it's probably pronounced. And he did sketches, and we looked at the Margam sketch, and it was very impressive. Well, Dinley did one at Ruperra Castle when the Duke stayed there in 1684. And it looks very different to the way it turns out. It's quite hard to see the castle, but you can see they still have the dormers.
And
the gables, the pointy gables.
And the round ends, the round corner towers.
They still have the corner towers, but as you can see, it's far more formal than it became in later years, because you have, a bit like Tredegar House, you have courts.
Yeah.
You have to come through this gate, go through what looks to be a very vast gate tower here.
Yeah.
Then and in fact, we think that was probably built, obviously, a little bit later. And Sir Thomas Morgan, actually, it says, the papers said that 80,000 bricks were made around about this time, which by a hand kiln, which were probably used to make the gatehouse, because the castle was built by then.
Yeah,
look how many steps
possibly even that surrounding wall, because that looks like brick as well.
Indeed. Yes, you're quite right. Of course it does. Yeah, I missed that. Also, these steps, it's quite steep steps you have to go up.
Yeah.
It's a very different sort of setting. I mean, if we compare it to a picture sort of 100 years later, where we assume Ruperra Castle is still very similar. So this is how it looks. If I make it a little bit bigger. There you are. Clearly, they've got rid of an awful lot of it.
Oh, yeah.
But this is their very swish storied porch. That's classical style. The gables are still here, looking very pointy.
Yeah.
But you've still got these almost archaic, almost a nod to Caerphilly Castle, chivalric towers, because it's not a real castle. It's a mock castle. It's a house playing dress up.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Act as a backdrop for the mast. So you could never defend Ruperra Castle.
No.
So you've got this bizarre mix. You've got a mix between the archaic, which I think will be good for their South Wales base, who hark back to earlier times. And you've got classical as a nod to fashion.
Yeah.
Which I think is an interesting little thing.
Well, also, never realised what an actually odd sort of looking building it actually is, really. The more you think about it, it's almost anachronistic, isn't it, in the way it's designed?
Yeah, it's a mix between the anachronistic and the ultra fashionable.
Yeah,
which is it's a pretty neat trick to pull off, I think. But this was Sir Thomas's castle, and I think this is the thing. I think he really wanted either James I or Charles I to turn up, because he's built this. He'd probably put a nice pageant on for them. It'll be splendid. Of course, they wait until he drops off the twig in 1641 or 1642. And then 3 years later, King Charles I, after the Battle of Naseby, turns up in the end of July and stays there for 3 nights, 4 days. So he comes in and he writes a letter to Prince Rupert from Ruperra Castle, the king does, and that letter survives. And clearly the king had a word with him, because afterwards the king's surveyor was in talks with the Morgans to actually have some decent formal gardens added. So the king probably went and thought, this is wonderful, but I'd love a formal garden here if I come again. Have you seen Raglan Castle? He probably said. And they were moving trees around and all sorts went on. But there we are. So that is the arms of the Stuart kings, which after the king stayed there, went on the porch.
Oh, interesting.
The arms of the king, and you've also got 2 smaller arms of the Earls of Pembroke, and a really mixed Lewis Morgan kind of coat of arms is on there as well. So, and I love the fact that it was Sir Philip Morgan, the murderer, who got the honour of looking after King Charles I. His dad was absolutely desperate to do it.
Yeah. Oh, God.
Anyway, guess what happened, Goff? The male line failed.
That
happened again. And so the Thomases, Elizabeth Morgan married the Thomases of Wenvoe. We haven't done Wenvoe. That's another big aristocratic place near Cardiff. And so the Thomases of Wenvoe, it became a secondary residence to Wenvoe near Cardiff. And then the male line failed. I think a little while after.
Yeah.
And what actually happened was then the Kemmis family of nearby Kevin Mabley, they married into the Thomas family, and Sir Charles Kemmis, so we're in the 1690s, he moved there.
Right.
If you remember, Kevin Mabley was sort of bashed about a bit, it would seem.
Yeah.
And it was a bit of a wreck for a while, so they moved down the road to Ruperra Castle. It was said, actually, that when Charles I visited Ruperra, although he and the aristocrats were in Ruperra Castle, some of his men stayed at Kevin Mabley, which makes sense. It's not big enough to house the complete retinue, is it?
No.
Now, luckily with Sir Charles Kemmis, if you want to know more about Sir Charles Kemmis, please go to our Kevin Mabley video. They had a bit of an inventory, and we know that in 1698 at Ruperra, Sir Charles Kemmis had 12 Caesars, very fashionable thing to have in the 1690s, and a portrait of Nell Gwyn.
Oh, yeah, keeping in favour with Charles II there.
Yes, I suppose so. But ultimately, the Kemmises then struggled with money. And it was in the early 1700s, in 1706, when the Morgans came roaring back with a younger son, John Morgan, who was known as John Morgan the Merchant, the younger son this time of the Tredegar branch. who'd made his money. He made his money with West Indian trade. Now, that trade involved lots and lots of different things. Almost certainly some of his ships were used for slaves, I would have thought, looking at the triangle of trade that his ships were.
Yeah.
But certainly he was a merchant in many, many things. It was a little bit like The Apprentice. His father sent him out, because he's a younger son, a fourth son, sent him out with £50 to make his money.
Oh, gosh.
The merchant moved to London, made his money, made an absolute fortune, and he decided when he got on a bit that he wanted to come back to South Wales to retire. So he was looking around for a residence, and Ruperra had financial difficulties, as it often did, throughout the late 17th, early 18th century, and he bought it in 1706 for £12,400.
Oh, gosh.
So the merchant was back in town, and he became, for a short while, what the Morgans often were, Member of Parliament. So he did that, but he wasn't married. So he lived at Ruperra Castle with his similarly unmarried sister, Katherine, or Katharina. Now, me and you know, Goff, that Katharina, or Katherine, was very lucky to get to this stage in her life, wasn't she? Could you tell us why?
Well, yeah. Well, just pop this up. Catherine, say Katharina. Basically, Katharina died at the age of 18. This is the prevailing story. She died. She was laid out overnight. It's very interesting, the sort of death ritual around that period. You weren't actually laid out in the coffin. You would actually be placed in your shroud on a trestle table in the most impressive room of the building. And they would surround the body with candles overnight to keep away sort of ill spirits and things like this. And somebody would sit vigil with the body overnight as well. And then in the morning, they would pick the body up and carry it out of the house and place it in the coffin outside. So we presume that sort of thing, similar thing happened to Katherine, is that she was brought out of the house, placed in the coffin. But also in that day as well, the pallbearers physically carried the coffin to the church. Now, the nearest church to Ruperra is St. Michael's and All the Saints at Lower Machen. So they head off for it, but when they get to Draven, they can't cross because the Rumney River's flooded and they can't get from one side to the other. So they bring the coffin back to the house and they take her out, and she lays out for a second night. And in the middle of the second night, she just sat bolt upright. She wasn't actually dead. She actually lived, if I just check this, I mean, she lived an enormous amount. She lived like another 53 years. So by the time she died, she was like 72 or so. I've done the sums properly. So she actually outlived everybody who was at her first burial.
I love that. Outliving the mourners.
Not only do you sort of, you survive your own first death, but you actually outlive everyone that came to see you off. And that was it. So she outlived everybody. She went on for a long time. There's a lovely little bit in the church of a plaque, because I think she after John, her brother, died, she managed the estates of Ruperra herself. Okay, so again, we've got a number of examples of Morgan ladies actually running these properties. Elizabeth Jones of Clither effectively running Tredegar House for a long time as well.
Quite right.
But Kathy says, so a little plaque put up in the church of St. Michael's to as a benefactors of the poor of Machen. And it says that Madam Katharina Morgan of Ruperra did by her last will and testament dated the 27th of June 1720 give £250 the annual interest thereof to an equivalent in land could be purchased, and then the annual rent or profit of ye lands to be annually applied to buy bread and blanketing for the poor of the parish of Machen forever. That's rather sweet. She also gave a pound a year, 20 shillings per annum to pay for the schooling of 2 poor boys of the parish forever. I'm not sure that £2 towards the schooling will go terribly far now, but there's still so she became quite a sort of a Lady Bountiful sort of figure in her way. perhaps it was a result of it. It's just that she didn't marry because you think she would have been a reasonably useful catch for someone. So perhaps the fact they thought she died once and come back rather put them off. I don't really know. But she didn't. And again, to her credit, she carried on, ran independently, ran an estate the size of Ruperra.
She did. I've seen documents at Aberystwyth in her hand where she's walked around the castle making a little inventory.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It's Katherine doing it. She is running the estate, which she probably ran a lot of the estate when her brother was alive as well, you suspect. She seems to be a lady that was extraordinarily capable lady. And
she might have been running the Ruperra property while he was off doing whatever commercial activities he was up to, because a lot of them are London-based, a lot of them, weren't they?
Yeah, and he didn't retire completely when he came back to South Wales, so I think you're quite right. Yeah, she's an interesting person. There is actually a little painting.
Oh, yeah.
But the Morgan. Were you going to say that?
Yes, I was going to say the mystery of the painting. As you said, I mistook it for another painting altogether, because there's a painting in the passing room in Tredegar House, which I always thought was Katherine in middle age, basically this little woman looked completely and utterly startled. So I thought, well, that's probably Katherine, because you would look startled if that had happened to you. And it turns out it's not. It's a different Mrs. Morgan of Ruperra altogether. But this portrait of Katherine, it's quite a small portrait, you were saying, and there's a plaque on it which details this story. And this is where I think I may have seen it. I got the two confused, because it features in a catalogue that was compiled by Courtney Viscount Tredegar of the artifacts, for a better phrase, in Tredegar House when he took over the property. And many a time when I was a tour guide, would look through the catalogue and you could see, all sorts of things listed. So I may have actually come across that picture there, but it has disappeared, has it not, Mr. Busby?
Well, we don't know where it is. I mean, but it's such a small painting, and it's such it's quite, well, not quite unique. You can't have quite unique. A unique painting with the legend on it, that it would be very easy for the descendants of the last Lady Tredegar to keep it. I mean, it's something I'd keep. Yeah. It wouldn't get an awful lot at an auction, but the historic value, I'd certainly keep it. It wouldn't take up much room, would it?
No.
So
I mean, it's interesting.
But we don't know.
Yeah, you said on a number of websites, you mentioned it's now listed as an apocryphal story. But I mean, it's sufficient to say that the Morgans believed it. Obviously, they propagated this story, they perpetuated it, and it's even noted on the family tree by a genealogist called Fletcher, isn't it? Who wrote? Remember that in the 30s, Paul? Yep. Yeah. Yep. So it's noted.
Put a plug here, Goff. Do your job. You can buy this family tree by Kill Fletcher, made in 1935, at the Tredegar House visitor reception.
Yes, in the Tredegar House visitor reception, we have several copies available. Should you wish to see them?
Oh, it's about £2.
Yeah, so it. I mean, it's like a lot of these stories. You could say obviously there's not going to be much evidence to support it necessarily, but you can say that the family at the time believed it and the population of the time believed it, and a lot of the stories that people believe about themselves get perpetuated as family myths and legends anyway. We do it ourselves, so it's still a valuable little story for the fact that they told it themselves. How much, if we'll ever tie it down as actually happening or not, who knows?
Yeah, it's likely that something similar happened, though, because the Morgans absolutely swore by that tale. Something's come down. Yeah. Well, I mean, it
was very, when they started clearing the graveyards in the 19th century to because they were over full, basically. So they were clearing the overstocked graveyards when they were opening up the large municipal cemeteries. They found an awful lot of evidence of people who could have suffered the same fate as Katherine. Live burial became a real phobia at that period. And of course, the judgment of it was very peculiar. When we didn't have the medical, forensic knowledge that we have now. So when somebody died in that case, and slightly mysterious like she may have, the coroner literally just called in old ladies of the parish. And old ladies of the parish came and looked at the corpse and went, "Oh, that's consumption, that is, eh? Oh, my uncle had that." And that was it. That was the medical diagnosis. If the old ladies all thought it was, leaping cringe, then you died of the leaping cringe. That was it, you know.
In fairness, the old ladies of the parish would have seen a bit of death, wouldn't they?
Well, at that point, mind you, the old ladies of the parish would have been about 45.
Well, everything's relative, I suppose. Well, what we got here is it was the River Rumney, according to Curl Fletcher, that flooded its banks, which thankfully ended up saving Katherine Morgan's life, because the funeral was postponed, as Goff said. Finally, in 1829, the Morgans put this iron bridge in over the Rumney, and that was to allow them to get to church from Ruperra Castle. So this was the new way to church. And by the way, and this continues to this day at St. Michael's and All Angels Church in Lower Macon, the Morgan family church, the Morgans, the Ruperra family church, that because it took the servants of Ruperra longer to get to the church, the services started 15 minutes later there, started at 11:15 to allow the servants of Ruperra to get there. And to this day, they still follow that tradition. It still starts at 11:15 because of that tradition started all those years ago by the Morgans.
Good Lord.
This was restored relatively recently. The famous
it does look
bridge.
very crisp, doesn't it?
Yeah. Now, Goff, remember that lady that you said that you saw and you thought it was Katherine, the painting?
Oh, yes.
Well, her name was Jane Colchester, and so it's about 30, 40 years after Katherine's time. So you would have got the fashion about right anyway. I can see how you could mistake that. She was married to this jolly chap.
Oh,
he went by the name of General Thomas Morgan of Ruperra.
Oh, I've heard of him many times. It's the first picture I've ever seen of him.
Yeah, it's annoying, Goff. This painting came up for auction in 2013, and I think it went for about $1,000 in America.
Oh, no, disappointing.
For us, it would have been worth a lot more on the walls of Tredegar House. There he is. He's a lot more jovial looking than I imagined him to be.
Yes.
He's called General because he was a general of the militia. The Morgans were always parts of the militia and then taking that as their title rather than regular army more often than not. But also he was Judge Advocate General. So he's in charge of the legal side of the British Army and court martials, and that became a family business, as it turned out, as the years went on. But he was the first one to be Judge Advocate General. So he took a sort of a legal swing in his career. His brother at Tredegar House, and it might have been them, actually. There's a wonderful... now, this is an apocryphal story, but it appeared in the Times, so we're going to say it anyway.
Yeah.
It said that when the father died, there were two brothers that were due to inherit. And in the cedar closet at Tredegar House was where the money was kept, you see, in the cupboards up above, the notes. So it must have been after the late 17th century, so it could have been these two brothers. And apparently it wasn't done particularly scientifically or legally. They got an old retainer from the estate with a fire shovel. He knocked down all the money from up above, and he put it into two piles. And he said, there you go, Master William. You have Tredegar House and this money. There you go, Master Thomas. You have Ruperra Castle and this money.
This shovel full of money.
That was just to part it. There was so much money, it was more than a shovelful.
Yeah. You have this lot. That's astonishing, isn't it?
So whereas General Thomas was the legal side of things and maybe a little bit more cautious and had a career of his own, his brother Sir William Morgan at Tredegar House spent £37,000 in 1 year on himself. Which in the 1720s is going some. You know, this is a man who paid £60 for a punch bowl, you know, a race course for Cardiff, married the Duke of Devonshire's daughter, so he had a bob or two, and he spent essentially all the money. The Tredegar Estate was in debt 10 years after this Sir William died at the age of 30. Meanwhile, General Thomas is having this respectable career and living at Ruperra Castle. But of course, Ruperra has now essentially become the secondary residence.
Yeah.
So Tredegar House, head of the family, Ruperra Castle, as it was in the Wenvo days, is now for the heir.
Yeah.
And General Thomas, what actually happens is the Morgans of Tredegar appear to they die. There were Sir William Morgan had a son who lived and drank himself to death, sadly. It was said that William Morgan, so General Thomas's nephew, at Tredegar House, died as ruined himself from drinking and waiting. And sorry, drinking and watching. Sorry, drinking. He didn't wait, he grabbed the bottle. Drinking and watching. Watching being a term for sleeplessness in the 18th century. So when the man who owns Tredegar, his nephew William the Younger, dies at the age of 38 in 1763, General Thomas of Ruperra is the rightful heir. He's going to move in and sort out the finances and sort everything out. Marvellous. And so much so, he allows his niece Elizabeth Jones of Clither to continue living there for about a year, kindly allowing her to get her affairs in order. She promptly changes the locks on the study door, takes all the papers she possibly can from Tredegar House to Clither. She'd married William Jones of Clither, and there's a big legal battle over who should really inherit Tredegar. And we tell the story that the main person, the main life force behind this battle against the villainous General Thomas Morgan of Ruperra is Elizabeth's mum, the widowed Lady Rachel Cavendish. But really, when you look as time goes on, Elizabeth Jones appears to be the brains and the fire behind all of this. You said she ran Tredegar House for her sadly not up to it brother, and you're quite right. She did for about 13 years. Yeah. And so she rightly well, maybe not rightly, actually, because think about this, the way the law was at that time, it all points to General Thomas, doesn't it? He is the male heir. Yeah.
But you could understand her umbrage.
Absolutely.
Having sort of maintained and run the property for her drunken brother, to suddenly feel it just slips out of her fingers entirely and goes off to her uncle. I mean, you can understand why she was aggrieved by the whole process, can't you?
Absolutely. And she did fight, and it went on for many, many years, ultimately for about 23 years at Chancery. So this is real jaundice versus jaundice stuff from Bleak House. You know, this went on, and it really crippled Tredegar and Ruperra finances throughout the latter part of the 18th century. And they didn't really give up. They carried on until the very end, and this whole thing outlived General Thomas. And outlived Elizabeth Jones. Elizabeth Jones has her memorial called Tredegar Castle, which is a wonderful wonderful folly, which is near Tredegar Park, which we have, which we mention in our Tredegar video. But interestingly, after the case was lost, Elizabeth and her mother stripped Tredegar House bare of all furniture. A lot of it was ruined when it was stored in a barn in Basleg, apparently. So General Thomas had to sort of refurnish everything. Elizabeth very helpfully offered up items of furniture for sale that she had taken from Tredegar House.
You got to admire the barefaced
to her uncle.
Yeah, it is one of those sort of Pyrrhic victories in a way, isn't it? Isn't it? Yeah, you get all the furniture, but it's all mouldy because it'd been stuck in a barn for 20 years. And the Morgans finally win and get the house, and it's falling down because no one's lived in it for 20 years. It's like, nobody really won out of this, did they?
No, nobody really won. You're absolutely right. But ultimately, the line continued with General Thomas Morgan's line of Ruperra taking over the Tredegar branch, you could say. Well, again, finances are shot to pieces. So this is another view of it as it looked. Now, as it looked before 1783. Now, we have it here in 1780. So General Thomas's line has continued. Oh, do you want to have a quick mention of the curse, Goff, at this point? Because I think it is relevant. Lady Rachel?
Oh, yeah. Again, it's another one of those Morgan or locality traditions is that the Morgans at Tredegar lived under the curse of Lady Rachel Cavendish, who was the second daughter of the second Duke of Devonshire, and she married William Morgan at the turn of the 18th century and went on for about the age of 85. Under the terms of her marriage contract, she was entitled to £2,000 a year for life. But she outlived him by 50 odd years, which is a huge drain on the family resources. Her son was basically too drunk to pay her properly. So by the time William the Younger died of drink in 1763, she was owed something like about £3,000, £5,000, I think it was actually. The whole estate was only worth about 3.5. So she did there was another case going on as well about her trying to sue for get this money back, and her also get parts of the estate for her daughters and things. No, ultimately, when they lose the case, Lady Rachel is supposed to have cursed the lot of them and said that no son of Thomas Morgan's shall ever bear an heir. And sure enough, his three sons, Thomas, Charles, and John, all inherited and all died without heir to the estate. And that was the end of the male line of the Morgans at Tredegar House, with this gentleman here, John Morgan, who died in 1793.
1792, but you were so
92,
close. It seems really churlish to.
Close, but no cigar. Close, but no cigar on that one.
I think you deserve a cigar, quite frankly. Yeah, John, very sad. You could say, Goff, the male line failed yet again.
Yet again.
But this was very tragic because he married a younger lady, Louisa Pym Burt, quite late in life, and she had many difficult pregnancies. But finally, in 1791, a year before John died, she gave birth to a son. And it seemed like the Ruperra and Tredegar line was saved, but sadly, the son only lived for half an hour. And that was Goff said is the end.
Gutting for both of them, really.
But John, before he died, he did live to see Ruperra rebuilt. Because in 1783, the Ruperra, as you see it here, was consumed by a gigantic fire, which ripped through the building, gutting it entirely. News sheets and newspapers say Ruperra Castle was destroyed. Now, you don't want this when you've already got legal problems, right? And money problems. But it would appear that most externally appears to have survived pretty well, showing how well it was built in 1626. But this did give the inside had to be rebuilt, it had to be restored, and John Morgan was the right man for the job. He was interested in the arts, he was interested in archaeology, and he oversaw the rebuilding of the built Ruperra Castle. He got an architect called Thomas Hardwick, and they redesigned it and rethought it. Unfortunately, it was complete in 1789, so at least John Morgan, who worked on it, did live to see Ruperra rebuilt. But it looked a little different. This is how it looked after the rebuild.
Yeah. Oh, yes, the dormer windows have disappeared, and it's again that
and the gables,
central roof, and the gables,
And this is, of course, you should know by now, anyone watching this who've watched a lot of our videos, that the artist for this is J.P. Neal. It is his style, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the porch has survived very nicely, but now we don't have the dormers, we don't have the gables, we have crenellated battlements.
Yes.
Going all the way through. Now, that original picture I showed you, do you remember I showed you an overhead view? Of the castle as it looked in 1627. That appears to have had a viewing platform with chimneys radiating out from it. So the viewing platform appears to have gone. This was sometimes used as a viewing platform.
Oh, right.
But access to it looks very different now it's been rebuilt.
Yeah.
The idea was, but inside it far more modern. They built vaults underneath the castle for more rooms and for kitchens and additional cellars and things like that. So they seized the opportunity of rebuilding Ruperra to make it more fitting for the 18th century and 19th century. So it was rebuilt artistically, yes, but also practically. So there are vaults underneath, which were the only thing that sort of survived the next fire we'll talk about fairly soon. But as you say, Goff, John Morgan was the last of the male Morgans. So Jane was the last, was a female Morgan, and she'd married this man, Sir Charles Gould. So by royal license, they were allowed in 1792, and by the will of John Morgan, for Sir Charles Gould to change his name to Morgan, and essentially they continued as if nothing had ever happened. There were still Morgans at Tredegar, and there were still Morgans at Ruperra. And Charles Gould Morgan, you can see here, has got horse guards in the background, and as he was Judge Advocate General as well.
Yes, yeah.
So he continued that sort of Morgan business. In fact, he's the longest serving Judge Advocate General in history.
Oh, gosh.
The office for that was his home in London at the time, 12 Downing Street. That's where Sir Charles Gould lived.
I couldn't remember the number the other day. I knew it was Downing Street.
It wasn't 10, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it wasn't 11, but...
It was almost. But he was a brilliant businessman. He was president of the Equitable Life Assurance Society, and he did sort of turn around the Tredegar fortunes and rebuild them and really put them laid the foundations for the prosperity that was to follow in the 19th century, which of course was good for Tredegar, but very, very good for Ruperra as well. It meant there was a Morgan heir living and thriving at Ruperra throughout the 19th century. And one of those was this chap.
Ah, Sir Charles.
Famous in Newport as Sir Charles Morgan, a great agriculturalist, butted heads with John Frost. And for those of you who have watched some of our earlier podcasts, his agent was Mr. Thomas Proderow, one of the most villainous agents.
Ooh.
I'm really disappointed, Goff. In fact, I'm gutted. I looked at the view count, and for the last week or so, the view count for our Thomas Proderow Malpas Court episode was 666, which seems fitting somehow.
Yes,
now
yes.
Now someone else has watched it and ruined everything. But the Charles you can see here did set up home at Ruperra, and in fact he was in charge of the Ruperra Volunteers, a sort of Dad's Army in Napoleonic times. And as an ex-prisoner of war in the American War of Independence, he was a military man, and he was in charge of the Ruperra Volunteers. There was also a Tredegar branch as well. Their pikes had R or T addressed on them, depending on which one you were.
Oh.
Very popular man. So Ruperra's thriving pretty well. Lots of kids, I'm pleased to say. Unfortunately, one of them, the eldest son, wasn't entirely a ray of sunshine at Ruperra, although he was a great agriculturalist. You can see him here. This is Charles Morgan Robinson Morgan, another MP. They're all MPs by this point.
Yeah.
But he, in 1859, had the very great pleasure of finally getting into the House of Lords as the first Baron Tredegar. So he moved to Tredegar House. He was the Lord Tredegar. Didn't get on with his dad, who we'd just seen. In fact, a scurrilous book published anonymously, but it's by Reginald Blewett.
Yes.
He's fooling nobody. So I have to say that Charles Morgan Robinson Morgan was not affected in the slightest when his father died. And he writes this about the first Lord Tredegar. I suspect Lord Tredegar is a hypochondriac. During his residency at Ruperra, Mr. Morgan, as was, had the character among those who are not acquainted of his condition of being a proud, morose, ill-tempered man. He often appeared to me as one labouring under a sense of great calamity or disappointment, some pervading sorrow.
Oh, good Lord, interesting.
When he lives at Ruperra, it seems slightly more gloomy than when his dad was there, to be perfectly honest. And the people of Lower Macon were relieved, no doubt, when he succeeded to Tredegar in 1846, because they had a brand new hope, a glamorous, young, charismatic, energetic inhabitant of Ruperra Castle. And he didn't last long.
Oh, poor old Charlie.
Indeed, I'm sorry, by the way, that I'm showing you so many faces in a row. We will finish with lots of images of Ruperra, but we can't, go without mentioning them.
I never thought that this would, that it never occurred to me, of course, that while First Lord Tredegar's down there in Tredegar, Charlie would be would have Ruperra. It didn't occur to me.
Yeah, well, he should have pretty much, but he travelled a lot, as we know, and he travelled a lot not necessarily for the right reasons. He fell hopelessly in love with a lady called Adela Mary Scroop. And Scroop sounds like a name from Dickens, but it is a real aristocratic name. The Scroops of Danby in Yorkshire, millionaires, but Catholic millionaires. And when Charlie, as he was known in the family, fell in love with Adela Mary Scroop, he proposed marriage. The Scroops loved the idea. His father and mother liked the idea slightly less and said they didn't want to run the risk of a Catholic taking over the family. They disapproved and forbade the match. At this point, Charlie seemed to go off the rails, rather. Oh, by the way, Adela Mary Scroop, if you're wondering why he's fallen in love with a Yorkshire girl, well, she's half Yorkshire, half Llanarth Court, because her mum was Mary Jones of Llanarth, which explains how they met. So they were on the Monmouthshire ball circuit and things like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, he goes off the rails. He he runs off with a Parisian singer called Emily Reynaud, and they run off to France. And Charlie ends up dying at the age of 25 in 1854. He was MP for Brecon, of course he was. But he's dead at 20. He's dead at 25, and it's such a blow to Tredegar and Ruperra that saw him as this great.
Of course, we ended up saying it was Charlie. He was Charles Rodney Morgan, wasn't he?
Morgan, yeah.
And his name persists in Newport in part today in the Rodney Parade, which was named for him. And
there was a relative, Lord Rodney, as well. So that's how the Rodney name comes into the Morgan family. Very, very sad. Emily Reynaud does in the end marry, and she is in fact the grandmother of the famous French artist Jean Cocteau. So the Morgans get just about everywhere, but poor Charlie, he died in Marseille in January.
But he did have heirs, did he not? He did have children.
Yes. And when the first Lord Tredegar finally died, disappointingly for him, at the age of 86, since he thought he was going to die at every possible illness, the kids, we're told that the kids did turn up, or one at least turned up, Charles-Marie Morgan, and tried to claim the estate. How they managed to hush him up, not entirely sure, because this man inherited the estate, Charlie's younger brother. It doesn't work well, me choosing that picture, because there's Charlie. Let's have a look at his younger brother.
Yes.
His younger brother being the famous Godfrey Morgan, Viscount Tredegar, a great public benefactor, opened the Transporter Bridge in Newport in 1906, gave land for the Royal Gwent Hospital, gave land for Rodney Parade, gave land for Bellevue Park and many other parks, and a lot of splot as well. So a very well-known man, and most famous, of course, for surviving the charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava in the same year that his elder brother Charlie died. I'm not sure that Godfrey really lived at Ruperra Castle as a permanent thing, really, because a lot of the notes say that when Charlie died, his sister Rosamond Marion Style took over, and they started playing cricket in front of the castle. Pitch in front of Ruperra. But the man who's really linked to Ruperra more than anything else is another brother, the younger brother again of these two figures, and that's this man.
Oh, Colonel Fred.
The irony is that Colonel Fred, whose name is attached to Ruperra, is the one who wasn't born at Ruperra.
Oh, God.
Godfrey was born at Ruperra, Charlie was born at Ruperra, Frederick was born in Brighton. Not sure how that happened. But Colonel Fred is here, painted by John Charlton. He has Ruperra Castle in the background, and he has his daughter Violet, later Violet Mundy. You always saw this man on horseback. Always. And he was a very old-fashioned man. He didn't change anything in Ruperra Castle to the point of it crumbling around his ears. His brother Godfrey hated change. Fred was even worse in that regard. He was MP for South Monmouthshire for many years, and it was said that on average he spoke for about 5 seconds a year in the House of Commons. This podcast would be a lot more digestible than ours, Goff. You might he wasn't long-winded, I'll give him that much. But here he is with Violet, and let's have a little look inside his house. This wonderful stone cantilever staircase, which went right up to the top of the castle. And we also have this. This is the dining room, and they've got a minstrel's gallery. So an orchestra could be up there playing as you dined. If you spot, Goff, the panelling, they'd have got panelling very much of the era that Ruperra Castle was initially built. In the 1620s and then burnt away. So they're trying to give you, the fact that it is, in fact, a 1620s castle. Wonderful doors. This up here is explaining the fire of 1783.
Oh, right.
That's what that is. That's stone there. And you've got these sort of arms dotted around. And Fred and Godfrey were fed up of people saying they were from the Chartist Rising. They weren't. They're from the Tredegar and Ruperra Volunteers.
Oh, right.
These got R's on them. And Tredegar had the same, with people thinking that they were, various things. If we have a little look, it's harder to see here. If we have another look at one of the rooms, you can see the dining room here. You can see the portrait above the mantel.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's interesting.
Is the John Charlton one. There's Freddie with Ruperra, and there's a painting of his father, the first Lord Tredegar, and one of his granddads, Sir Charles Morgan. And all three of those paintings are now safe and sound at Tredegar House.
What about those horse paintings, Paul, underneath them? Because they look
Again,
familiar as well.
They do. Are they the Mullock paintings? This one
Yeah.
appears to be a painting of his father with possibly Sir Briggs the horse in front of the Edmund Gates. But I can't be sure.
No.
It's too indistinct, isn't it, to be certain?
Yeah, it's difficult to tell there.
It seems
likely.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's have a look how it looks in this period. There we go. Ruperra at a sort of pomp. Colonel Fred was extremely popular in the area. There's a great little story that he hated anyone leaving his employment. Really hated it. He used to say he fought at the Battle of Inkerman, the soldiers' battle in the Crimean War, and at the Hollybush pub nearby, Colonel Fred would have an Inkerman dinner, whereas Godfrey Morgan would have a balaclava dinner because he was at the charge of the Light Brigade. And Fred would often stand up and say, "You've got a friend in me, I've got your back." But the difference is he meant it. And when one man said he was offered a good business opportunity and he had to leave the estate, Fred said to him, "Oh, do you have to leave? Can't you do a half day every now and then? Just pop down every now and then." So he did, and his salary remained the same as before.
Good Lord.
Oh, to have a boss like Colonel Freddie Morgan.
Right, yeah, indeed, yeah.
Wouldn't it be tremendous?
Yeah.
Now, his sister Violet, great horsewoman as well, became Violet Mundy. Had a home in the West Country. And she was a great horsewoman as well, took after her dad in many, many ways. And I think she did at Ruperra what she did at Tredegar. She used to have, they were called black drops. They were peppermints. She used to keep them in her stocking tops. Ruperra and Tredegar, she used to go in the garden. She liked chatting to the gardeners. She liked carnations, so she'd visit the carnation house. And she'd go up to the gardeners at Ruperra and Tredegar, and she would say, "Would you like a peppermint?" And then she would plunge her hand down her waistband and rummage around for what appeared to be hours before emerging with this peppermint. And one of the gardeners said, "After all that, I really didn't fancy eating that peppermint." But we always said yes to watch the performance. Violet was a wonderful woman. Colonel Freddie, towards the end, got very, very ill. His wife, Charlotte, went blind. He lost most of his sight as well. He had bronchitis. He had rheumatism very badly because he'd ride in all weathers. You'd always see the colonel riding around Ruperra Castle, no matter what the weather, no matter what the temperature. And it caught up with the old boy in the end. And he sort of ailed. He had sticks and dark glasses, and he would sort of follow the hunt in a motor car. And it wasn't quite the same. No. It looked for a long time as if Freddie would take over Tredegar House because his elder brother Godfrey didn't have any children. So Ruperra was going to cede a bit because he really wasn't. He wasn't paying for upkeep. He didn't like change. He had an eldest son, Courtney Morgan, who was the main force of change at Ruperra. In 1908, the year before Freddie died, Courtney insisted that electricity was put into Ruperra Castle in 1908. He later did the same at Tredegar House, influencing his uncle Godfrey.
It's quite interesting because Godfrey was Fred's brother, and he also was very resistant to change, and he didn't have electricity until in Tredegar House till he died in 1913. So it's interesting. They both seem to be, and they both. Godfrey talks on a lot about the old ways and the old traditions. They do seem to be very much of a mind with that, don't they? They don't want things to change for something. Interesting psychology that.
The psychology comes across actually in the architecture of the castle. Now, a very interesting thesis by Mark Baker was done on, which mentioned this on country houses in Wales. He says, like I said earlier on, you've got the mix between the classical and fashionable, but Welsh families in particular have to have these towers. They have to have the tradition. You've got to have the tradition. You've got to be embedded in the soil.
Yeah.
And the Morgans, be they Morgans or Gould Morgans, always were. These weren't people who would leave their country home and go and live in London.
No.
Freddie Morgan lived at Ruperra Castle.
Yeah.
Godfrey Morgan lived at Tredegar House. You know, that's the way it worked.
Yeah.
So it's, but of course, all good things must come to an end, as Freddie is doing. Freddie dies in 1909 at the age of 72, I believe. And when he's there, Godfrey, his brother, is with him, and his two sons, Courtney, is with him, and so is Frederick George, and so is Violet of Peppermint's fame. So they're with him when he dies at Ruperra Castle. Where else would he die? And they still talked about the old colonel years after his death. But then a few years later, his elder brother, Godfrey dies as well. This is an image of the famous Godfrey Viscount Tredegar's funeral. And it's heading off to St. Basil's Church, Baysleg. Enormous. Look at the police behind.
Oh, yeah.
It was raining. It was an awful day, an absolutely awful day. That meant that the new Lord Tredegar, he lived at Ruperra for a little while, and he did it up. He added a power sort of station, a powerhouse for electricity. He had to rebuild the stables, which had burnt down in 1890, but his dad, Freddie, hadn't touched them. So Courtney and the horses weren't happy.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So Courtney had to sort of rebuild them, and he paid money restoring. He spent a lot of money on Ruperra Castle. Some say trying to get his wife and possibly his son to live there, but neither did.
No.
But I love the way that Courtney at this stage has the moustache of his illustrious father and uncle.
Yes, yeah, I've never actually seen this picture of him with a moustache before. It actually really doesn't suit him at all, does it?
He shaved it off. There we are. It's rebuilding is going on. All kinds of stuff is going on at Ruperra Castle. The workmen are in. But then Courtney, of course, has to move to Tredegar House as Lord Tredegar. The newspapers said that actually he prefers Ruperra Castle, so maybe Tredegar House's future is uncertain at this point. I'm not sure what the evidence really for that other than speculation is, because Courtney does move to Tredegar House, as was his duty, of course. But Ruperra Castle at this point, sadly, because his son, Evan Morgan, didn't want to live there, meant that, this sort of thing happens.
Oh, right. Oh, just mothballed.
Mothballed, dust covers, and darkness in many ways.
Oh, gosh.
Which is a terrible, shame.
I thought Courtney spent a lot of time there, but not after he became Lord Tredegar then.
Well, he did spend a bit of time there. I mean, dust covers can be whipped off.
Yeah.
And so you had your dust covers, and they would be whipped off when needed. It became a shooting box more than anything else. Shooting box, a hunting lodge, call it what you will. Courtney had also bought Kevin Mabley nearby, so the estate then ran all the way south. So he bought that. But yeah, it's nice to actually see Ruperra. A very rare photograph here of one of the rooms. But the gardens are magnificent, as you can see.
Oh, yeah.
So although the house is sort of being left, the gardens were not left. Angus MacKinnon, the man with the foghorn voice, Scott's gardener, was in charge of these. And this wonderful landscape garden you can see, terraced almost garden. And they had these wonderful glass houses, which were made in Edinburgh. By Mackenzie and Moncur, which were there. Again, extraordinarily beautiful gardens. And the gardeners were pretty hard working because, of course, whereas the servants are sort of mothballed and you've got a housekeeper, the gardeners still have to work full time pretty much.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
You've got to keep this going until, just in case Lord Tredegar turns up. So it continues. I think I got another little view of the gardens. Looking rather
that's cool.
Yeah. So look, there was one of the gardeners. I love thinking about it. One of the gardeners was Tom Beachy, and he used to live in one of the lodges. But the front was kept locked because of damp. And they had to walk half a mile to get water each day. And when they knocked down the lodge, they found that the reason it was damp because there was a spring underneath it.
Oh, God. God.
I know. Terrible.
Dear me.
They used to have what was called a sporting poacher, Dick Everson, who lived in Racken Row. Dick Everson, he was a miner. It's called a sporting poacher.
Sporting poacher?
Sporting poacher, because when Reg Blackburn, who was the gamekeeper, what he would do, Dick, was he would fire a shot in the air to wake him up, and he had to come and chase him.
Oh, God.
If he ever caught him, they went to the pub together. There was a man that Courtney was particularly fond of, a young man called Ivor Coslet, who was a sort of, I think he would have said he had learning difficulties today. And he was given a job of keeping the drive. He had to sweep the drive right up to Ruperra Castle. And Courtney loved the lad.
Yeah.
Whenever Courtney turned up, he treated him like a son.
Oh,
At one point he
gosh.
said, I wish I was his son. And I think Courtney possibly wished that as well with the relationship he had with his own son. Ivor, his name was Ivor Coslet. We had Octavius Morgan, who worked on these gardens as well. He was 6'5" tall, and he was at the Somme. There was an explosion. He was buried up to his neck, and he was left there for 3 days. He was buried in an upright position. Very Ruperra.
Good Lord.
Very Ruperra.
Yes,
In
indeed.
an upright position. He said, if I was a few inches shorter, I would have died. I'd have had no chance, Goff. I'd have been well gone.
Well, no. You'd have been under it.
I'd have been I tell you what, I would have been an absolute giant in the Bantam Brigades.
Well, in the Bantam Brigade.
Courtney brought
Tall
his
Colonel
chef.
Busby.
Whenever Courtney was at Ruperra for shooting, he'd bring his chef, Monsieur Vogel, from Tredegar House. And Monsieur Vogel, when at Ruperra, his kitchen was almost near the basement. And he'd look out of the window, and Courtney insisted on riding a pony at Ruperra. I don't know why, he never did it at Tredegar. And Vogel would look out the window and say, oh, here he is, Jesus Christ coming into Jerusalem. Vanishing days. There's Ruperra. And of course, his son didn't want to live there. There's Courtney in later years. He died in 1934, and it really was the end of an era when he died because his son wasn't quite of the Ruperra stock.
No. To be fair to Evan, he didn't dress like that habitually.
No, not habitually, but there he is, looking rather exotic. But he did. When he took over Ruperra, there was a wedding there at Ruperra where Evan played host in 1935, and you can see him here kissing the bride of his second cousin, the Forestier Walker, on the steps of Ruperra Castle.
Oh, yeah.
So there he is. But 1935 was a momentous year because Ruperra was up for sale. It was decided to sell Ruperra. And there we are. Foster Stedman, the agent, lived there for a time in 1914, but it was decided to sell it. And nobody bought it.
Yeah.
The stuff inside was sold or went to Tredegar House. There's a very fine washstand, which is posing as a desk at Tredegar House, and that was bought by Courtney for Ruperra Castle. In fact, when you think about it, because Lady Rachel took all the furniture from Tredegar House, any antique furniture the Morgans owned, Morgan Antiques, would have come from Ruperra, wouldn't it?
Yes. Yeah. That's interesting, yeah.
And that sort of continued on. So nobody wanted to buy it, sadly.
It's the wrong time, isn't it, for it?
It is. And during World War II, there were troops billeted there. And on the night before Pearl Harbor, the 6th of December, 1941, there were many troops billeted there. Signals were billeted there, Dutch troops, Indian troops, German prisoners of war in later years. Magnificent setting. But on December 6, 1941, an electrical fault set another great conflagration, which burnt Ruperra out. And here we actually see a hollowed out shell with a bit of black from charring.
Oh, yeah.
But again, it's stayed up fairly well. And what we've got here is the servant buildings. Courtney turned them into servant accommodation. There used to be the dairy and there used to be the laundry. Courtney wanted to build a billiard room about here, linking the two. But I think he moved to Tredegar House before he could put that in operation. But it's burnt out. Evan, it was said, when he was told, was very distressed when he was told that Ruperra was burnt. But, you know, what can you do? I mean, there's not much that could be done. 1948.
Apparently, am I right to saying it burnt down particularly as well because the fire engines got stuck in the lanes and they couldn't actually get to it?
Yeah, and the water supply at Ruperra was never particularly great.
Yeah.
They couldn't get there. You could see the flames from Newport and Cardiff, it was said. Terrible fire, terrible fire. So you couldn't use the castle. The National Trust in 1943 had a look at it, but rejected it. And again, it would have been a massive job for them in 1943. The gardens were now left. Still beautiful countryside. This is what I like to call the conifers of doom. After the First World War, with timber being a shortage, Courtney was told really, to put conifers on his estate because they're fast growing for timber. Unfortunately, the conifers grow quickly and took over the old woods of Ruperra. They've currently started removing the conifers and the old flowers have started to grow back.
Oh, interesting.
Okay,
Look at that.
which is lovely. But there we are, sort of burnt out. I do like a story, by the way. In 1948, when Evan was still alive, some children of the estate were allowed to come to Ruperra Castle for a picnic, and then jumping out of the bushes was Evan's agent Harry Ware dressed as King Charles I. I think King Charles I should jump out of bushes at unsuspecting people to continue that tradition.
Tradition.
Very day. Evan died and was eventually, his cousin John Morgan, who you can see here, took over. John was a cousin. He didn't know, obviously, what to do with Ruperra, and in fact, he decided that Tredegar had to be sold as well. He sold up, moved to Monte Carlo, but he didn't forget the keeper Reg Blackburn, who had taught him to shoot. When he took over, he tracked down his widow, who'd lived in Essex, and made sure she got £100 a year for the rest of her life.
Oh,
because John was so fond of the old.
Not an insignificant amount of money at that time.
No, not in the no, absolutely 50s, not in the 50s. So fair play to John, but the estate was sold, and Ruperra went in the 1956 sales of the entire estate, the last 53,000 acres that remained, and Ruperra, one of the last things to be sold. There it is, looking at its best. There it is before 1982. You can see a big worrying crack in the southeast tower.
Yeah.
There it is with the tower fallen.
Oh, gosh.
It's just getting worse. There it is, an aerial view, a recent one. He completely burnt out, and it's only got worse, you see, since the fire, because nothing's been done to it. So here's how it looks today. Inside, I should point out, it is privately owned, and it is very dangerous if you try and go inside Ruperra Castle. These photos were taken by people who were working there. So, oh dear, look at it.
Yeah.
It was once an extremely beautiful place, Ruperra Castle. But the vault survived, of course. The vault survived that was built by John back in the 18th century.
Yeah.
So they are still looking fairly well.
Yeah.
But there was work done recently. They had to take away one of the chimneys. So what they did was they've got this through, and this is the chimney worrying. So they numbered it all. And they took them all down and put them on pallets. So hopefully one day that chimney, fingers crossed, will be put back up.
Yeah.
This is how it looks today. Once such a glorious place. And there we are. But we've still got these. The outbuildings are in a far better condition. So what you can see here is this was servant accommodation. Used to be the dairy and the laundry, but Courtney converted it. Courtney rebuilt an entire stable block after his father didn't, after 1890. It's a very substantial stable block. The blacksmith shop is still fully intact as well. And you have the generator room that Courtney built for the electricity. Here you can see the back of those wonderful glass houses that I mentioned.
Oh, yeah. The one that's
on
left today. Oh, gosh. Yeah.
But there is a little bit of hope, because this is Lulworth Castle that looks very much like Ruperra. It's in Dorset. Yeah. Very much like Ruperra, especially the original Ruperra with the steep steps that Dingley records. That was burnt out, and it is now used for weddings and all sorts. It's a shell in places, but they've used it as a possibility of possibly a brighter future. Who knows with Ruperra? It's bounced back before, but my goodness, it's gone through a lot recently, hasn't it?
Oh, quite, yeah. Well.
So that was Ruperra Castle. We had to dash through. There's so much, you see, about Ruperra that we could have got bogged down. We probably did in places, of which I apologise. But yeah, so that's Ruperra Castle, Goff.
Well, it's nice actually. Do it as Ruperra, because when you focus on Tredegar, as we've done so much for our working lives, you tend to think of it as being a sort of the other property. You don't realise that it's got its own history, its own line of history. And that's right.
Distinct history. You're quite right.
Distinct and separate history. Yeah.
Its own distinct history, and it's a very special place. So hopefully the future is a bright one. You never know.
No.
Things have come back from worse, though it is pretty bad. So who knows? Ruperra Castle has come back before. I wouldn't write it off completely, but it is a place that people don't know is there, and it's still in matchless, beautiful countryside.
Yeah.
I would say if you're going to see it, you can get quite close to Ruperra using the public footpaths. I'd go to the Hollybush Inn and then go across the field next to it and visit Coed Craig Ruperra, which is owned by the trust.
Yeah.
That is the Conservation Trust, Ruperra Conservation Trust. But do visit Ruperra and have a little look, because it is well worth, and it is a massive part of the history of Southeast Wales.
Yes.
By the way, I just noticed the last video, I promised a Glamorgan video, and I'm kind of hedging a little bit, because Glamorgan was often referred to as being in, Ruperra was referred to as being in Glamorgan.
Oh, right.
Ruperra now comes under Caerphilly, but the note paper that Colonel Freddy used said quite clearly Ruperra Castle, Newport.
All right.
A bit of a stretch today, but
yes,
there you
it
go.
is,
So I haven't lied entirely to you.
Entirely.
So thank you very much for watching, and I'm sure
thank you.
we might be back soon with something a little more spooky.
Yeah.
It's Goff's terrain. He'll run the next one. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.